Good morning, buenos dias, and welcome to today's presentation and preliminary work session on the Superintendent's recommended fiscal year 2026 capital budget and amendments to the fiscal year 2025 through 2030 capital improvements program. Welcome to our board members, MCPS staff, and members of our community who are joining us here today, and those who are watching this meeting via live stream. I would now like to ask board members to introduce themselves.
Pernille Suvarna, student member of the board.
Rebecca Smondrowski, District 2.
Good morning, Brenda Wolf, District 5.
Good morning, buenos dias. Grace Rivera Oven, District 1.
And I'm Carla Silvestre, president of the board. Ms. Harris.
Good morning, everyone. Lynn Harris. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an at-large member of the board.
During today's meeting, the superintendent will present his recommended fiscal year 2026 capital budget and amendments to the fiscal year 2025-2030 CIP. The board will then hold hearings on Monday, November 4th and Wednesday, November 6th to allow members of the public to provide testimony on these recommendations. These hearings will be held in person and will be open to the public. The board will also accept pre-recorded audio and video submissions for individuals who wish to remain virtual. Information about our meeting and hearing schedule, how to sign up online for the hearings, and how to submit testimony is available on our website. Following these hearings, the board will hold another work session on Friday, November 8th. If alternatives are offered during the November 8th work session, the board will hold an additional hearing on Tuesday, November 12th. The November 12th hearing will only be held if alternatives are offered during the November 8th work session. Accordingly, interested individuals should sign up to provide their testimony during the hearings on November 4th or November 6th. If a hearing is held on November 12th, the board will conduct an additional work session on Thursday, November 14th. The board will then meet on Thursday, November 21st to make its final decisions on the CIP. If there are items that the superintendent is recommending in his presentation today that board members may wish to modify, it would be helpful for affected communities to know about a potential modification prior to the public hearings. Therefore, I am encouraging us to identify any potential modifications at today's work session. Before I turn the meeting over to Dr. Taylor, I would like to remind board members that this is just the superintendent's presentation of the CIP. Although clarifying questions are in order, we will have an opportunity to explore the CIP more in depth and ask our questions during the next work session. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam President and members of the board. As excited as I am to recommend my first capital budget for FY26, I would like to share some disappointment in leading off today's presentation with an issue. As has been reported already, while preparing this capital improvements program budget, we identified an error in our submission for state aid in the Charles E. Woodward High School construction project, creating a revenue shortfall of $39.3 million in the FY26 capital budget. In a moment, you'll hear details from our team about this issue and how it relates to the rest of the capital improvements program amendments that I'm proposing today. However, before they present, I will fill in some of the blanks. I want to share some important points and a note of thanks. When you hired me this summer, you made it clear to me that you wanted MCPS to restore trust in our community and for me to call out irregularities when I saw them. Thank you for having the courage and faith to tackle this issue and many other issues that arise. As we voluntarily and openly disclose this issue, please know that we will discover more things in the future and we will address those things as they come. Though this submission error dates back to 2021, where none of the key personnel involved in the decision still work for MCPS, it is never easy to break bad news. But as I'm fond of saying, bad news does not get better with age. I'm happy to be in a position to address this issue now instead of later when it could be significantly costly. I would also like to thank our partners in state government who are working to make sure that we get this right and that we are following the law and our own policies. They have been a great resource and great support. To that end, I want to make it clear that this issue was entirely MCPS's fault. We are working to correct it, and though this will not have a net negative impact on state construction revenues over the long run, it does have an impact on these projects, and I'm sorry for that. At MCPS, my expectation is that staff at all levels of the organization work to identify financial irregularities and to adhere to proper financial protocols and practices. We must do this work with integrity. Part of my commitment to the district, our county, and our students is to encourage Team MCPS to address problems when they see them. Naming them and doing something about them is part of our path forward together. Therefore, we should not be surprised if issues are uncovered as we do this essential work. These are opportunities for the system to improve and to live up to its values of transparency and accountability. Our district budget comes in two parts: capital, which we're here to talk about today, and operational, which we'll begin talking about in December. As we continue to work on our operating budget, we are taking an equal in-depth look into how we spend our operational funds. Our community deserves an MCPS that spends its money wisely and in the best interest of students, and we will deliver on that. I appreciate the efforts of the Board of Education, the County Council, and our state partners in working to support the fundamental objectives of our capital budget, which ultimately benefits Montgomery County students. We understand that seeking local funding can place a strain in our community. As we move forward, we will work with our state and with our local funding partners to provide the infrastructure necessary for all MCPS students and staff to thrive. So in keeping with the county's practice, my off-year amendments to the already approved FY25, FY30 capital improvements plan are aimed at preserving already identified projects and seeing those projects to a successful completion. I'm pleased to present to you a recommendation that keeps our major school projects on track and makes use of our resources within our already approved allocation to minimize our impact on the county's funding resources. As the board knows, we have many capital improvement needs for major maintenance support and school replacement. And I'm already looking forward to addressing those needs in a more robust manner in next year's CIP budget presentation. Until then, at this time, it's my pleasure to pass the presentation over to Ms. McGuire, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor and members of the board. I would like to start with providing some additional details to the issue that Dr. Taylor highlighted in his remarks, and that certainly has been a subject of discussion. So the issue really is around state aid eligibility. State aid, and this is an important piece to know about state aid, is awarded to MCPS project by project and based on very specific state eligibility rules. And so because of that, we have to apply for the state aid, again, in each project and get approval from the state in each project. The error that has been referenced, and again relates to the Charles Woodward High School project, was because we assumed a higher level of state aid at the beginning of this project than ultimately we have been awarded, and that is what results in this gap. It is important to recognize that our total state aid allocation, particularly from the Built to Learn Act, which was the important legislation that our state General Assembly provided, that total allocation will in fact continue to accrue to MCPS. But because we have to apply project by project, it will come to us when we have additional eligibility. And right now, the CIP is maxed out on how much state aid assumptions we have in the CIP that we are eligible for. So again, the overall state aid award to us from Build to Learn will ultimately accrue to us over time. However, at this moment, we have reached all the eligibility for state aid that we can. And again, in the case of the Woodward project, we are below what was originally assumed in the CIP. So what happened with that was that the contracts for the Woodward project were billed in multiple phases, as I know the board is aware. And so when we were doing the capital planning for these projects, we did assume that we would have that maximum level of state aid across all of the projects. However, ultimately, not all of the phases were eligible at that high level. As we worked with the state and as we resubmitted that information, the state is awarding the aid for the project at a lower level of eligibility. And as a result, again, our assumptions are off by this amount of funding. If we could go to the next slide. We do want to emphasize, as Dr. Taylor said, that this CIP recommendation does really strive to minimize the impact on local resources. As part of our review of projects and our review of approach to the CIP, we were able to identify a significant amount of funding, $17.7 million, in prior projects that are predominantly completed. And these are funds that we believe and know that we will not need in order to complete the sort of punch list items for those projects. Those unexpended balances can be carried forward into the CIP to help support this revenue gap. At the same time, we will still need $21.6 million in order to keep these projects in the CIP whole. And again, that relates to the fact that the CIP is built on certain revenue assumptions, and now those revenue assumptions are incorrect. We are working with the state. We've been working very closely with the state, and we do appreciate their partnership, both in helping us resolve and get to a place of accuracy with this situation, but also we are working with them to determine, are there any other aspects of aid in this project or others that we can be eligible for, that we can have allocated. And certainly if we get good news, we will be very, very happy to share it, but we wanted to build the CIP on what we know now, in the hopes certainly that this revenue picture could get a little better. Again, we really appreciate the state's partnership in that work. So with that explanation, we would like to move more to talk just broadly about the CIP as a whole. And again, this issue with the funding with the revenues are one aspect. Our off-year CIP approach really is about keeping our major projects whole. Interestingly enough, the superintendent's recommended FY26 budget and amendments to the CIP actually totals the same expenditure level as what is in the current approved CIP. So we are not actually recommending any increases to the expenditure total of the CIP, and that total is $1.853 billion. However, as we just discussed from a revenue standpoint, we do need an additional $21.6 million of local revenue in order to support all of those programmed expenditures. The off-year CIP amendments are focused on keeping these major projects on track, both in terms of addressing any additional cost increases, but also fully completing all of the build-out elements. And you will hear more about that, but it does include auditoriums, for example, to really take these major projects through to their full completion in this CIP. The amendments, in order to do this, do reallocate funds from placeholder dollars in certain projects without defined scopes in order to support the immediate priorities that are shovel-ready and actually shovel-active at this time. So that reallocation does, again, help us limit our impact on requesting new local dollars. Significantly, there are no major CIP changes in this request. Again, we're focused on maintaining the projects that we have and that we need to finish. But as Dr. Taylor said, we are working on the foundations to really understand, plan, and prepare for the scope and priorities that we know we need to bring forward on behalf of the board and to the board next year in the full CIP. And with that, we're going to move on to talk about other aspects of the presentation.
Good morning. Just to share with you the timeline, and Ms. Silvestri already articulated the direction we're going. Today, we do start with the preliminary work session with 2 public hearings following in the next several weeks on the 4th and the 6th of November. We do have another work session on the 8th as a follow-up from today, and then moving toward the actual board action on the amended CIP on November 21st. If there is a need for an additional public hearing or a public work session, that time is already identified for us to do that in the middle of November. To share some information about enrollment so that we have an understanding of our student population here in MCPS. For pre-K-12, looking at our preliminary enrollment. Post-pandemic, MCPS saw a steady increase of enrollment from school year 2007 to 2019, increasing from 137,745 students to about 165,267 students. For this school year, our preliminary enrollment as of September 30th is 159,671 students. And this is a one-year decrease of about 552 students from last year to this year. But we are projected in school year 2030, 2031 to see an increase of students to about 162,178. And so over time, you can see we have gone up, we have decreased as aligned with what we know from the pandemic, and now we are kind of at a plateau of what we see here. The second piece we wanted to be able to share regarding enrollment, that even though enrollment is going down, the academic services to students and where programs are placed across the district do require additional class space for many of those programs. And so I'll actually start on the right in terms of the number of students receiving additional services. And on those orange and blue line graphs, you'll see the orange are students, our emergent multi-language learners in terms of the number of students and how that population has grown over the years. What you'll see on the blue line would be our special education, students who receive special education services. And with those, especially in terms of our students who receive those special education services, there are often class spaces and dedicated space that we do need to provide in order for those programs to function adequately to meet the learning needs of students. On the left-hand side, in terms of the line graph that you see from FY20 to FY25, you'll see an incline from FY20 really to FY23 and moving up in terms of the number of students who receive free and reduced meal services across the district. And so as we think about our population of students and families within Montgomery County Public Schools, we also have to think about the spaces in which they need in order to really be able to support them. The last note that I do want to bring to the attention of the board is the last bullet under, we talk about our community schools, our Title I schools, and our focus schools. And I bring those up from a standpoint of with our community schools that are attached to the blueprint, there are certain things that those schools actually require a little bit more space. We know in many of those schools they have food pantries, they have places in which younger children come in and they service the communities in different ways. So we have places in our schools that are classroom spaces, but also community-based spaces that do provide support to what that instructional program does end up being. And for our Title I and focus schools, our class sizes are lower, so we're talking about more teacher spaces, and we're talking about smaller classes that are there. So we do want to take that into account as we think about our projects and what we need to do in terms of the work within our district. At this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Connolly to talk a little bit more about the funding of the CIP and just the whole scope around the projects that Ms. McGuire shared earlier.
All right, thank you, Ms. Edwards. So the CIP is funded from 4 types of revenue sources. The first revenue source is general obligation bonds, which is the largest revenue source that funds the CIP. The county council sets these spending affordability guidelines at the level of bonded debt that they think the county can afford. The next revenue source is state aid. Each year, MCPS applies for state aid eligible projects, which are additions, major capital projects, HVAC, and roof replacements. Other revenue sources include school impact tax and recordation tax. The impact tax, which is currently being reviewed by the County Council in the 2024-2028 Growth and Infrastructure Policy Update, is applied to the capacity projects when new developments are built, which also provides additional revenue to our CIP. Recordation tax is a portion of the tax collected when a residential property is transferred to a new owner, and this revenue source can be used for any CIP project. And lastly, current revenue is the same funding source as the operating budget and can be used for particular projects like relocatable classrooms, tech mod, and facility planning. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Taylor noted, his recommendation and approach are to keep our major projects whole and on schedule. These projects include a recommendation of $28 million to complete the auditorium and other associated spaces at Charles W. Woodward High School. This will be the third and final phase of this project. A recommendation of $20 million to complete the auditorium, shelled classroom spaces, and stadium turf at Crown High School. This will be the second and final phase of this project. The recommendation includes $5 million to upgrade the stadium at Northwood High School. And lastly, to address some HVAC issues, Dr. Taylor is recommending an increase of $4.5 million in order to complete an additional project, which would be the second phase of A. Mario Lorderman Middle School. In total, these major project increases amount to $57.5 million. Next slide. So as Dr. Taylor discussed earlier, in an effort to be fiscally responsible, the recommendation is to reallocate funds from previously approved projects in our CIP. It's recommended that $4 million be reallocated from the Building Modifications for Program Improvements countywide project. This project, also known as BIMPI, is typically used for a wide variety of small renovations throughout our district, whether it be updating our media centers, adding restrooms for specific programs, things of that nature. The recommendation is also to reallocate $36.5 million in the Early Childhood Center countywide project. While MCPS is committed to increasing our full-day pre-K footprint, we are in the process of analyzing our current facility inventory and finalizing our pre-K expansion plan. We have funds in this project that will be able to renovate the existing Burtonsville Elementary School, which has been identified to be an early childhood center that can serve the East County once Burtonsville moves to their new site. Once our pre-K expansion plan is complete, we will be requesting funds in a future CIP. It's important to note that with this reallocation, we are intentionally not trying to outbuild our operating budget. The recommendation also is to reallocate $12 million from the Major Capital Projects Elementary Countywide Project. These funds will be coming from the 4 major capital projects that have approved planning funds, as well as placeholder construction expenditures. These projects are Cold Spring, Damascus, Twin Brook, and Whetstone Elementary Schools. It's important to note that none of these projects have full construction expenditures in the adopted CIP, therefore they do not have an anticipated completion date. It's also important to note that it was always the intent for these projects that we would have a future CIP request once the scope of each project has been identified. The recommendation also is to reallocate $5 million from the Sustainability Initiatives project.
So I would like to add a little bit about the Sustainability Initiative and the reduction. With this reduction, there's going to be still enough funds left in our sustainability budget to continue existing projects that we have already underway, to improve the infrastructure for existing schools, to implement energy conservation measures. And what we wanted to do, and we'll talk about it a little bit later when we talk about the foundational work that we're going to be undertaking between now and the next CIP, where we will be looking at the overall our portfolio and see that how we blend that sustainability initiatives into meeting our long-term greenhouse emissions goals. So we are still leaving enough budget in our sustainability portfolio to continue our current initiatives.
So with those reallocation of funds, that was $57.5 million, which is our net zero increase for this CIP, this recommended CIP. Next slide. So reducing our revenue gap. So as we noted at the beginning of the presentation, MCPS will receive $39.3 million less in state aid for the Charles W. Woodward project than it was assuming. So to be as fiscally responsible as possible, the superintendent is recommending that MCPS transfer $17.7 million of remaining balances from prior projects back to the county. It's important to note that these transfers do not impact the scope of these prior projects, as most just have minor punch list items remaining. The projects with transfers include $7 million from the Bimpy project, $5 million from the William Tyler Page Addition project, $3.4 million from the Westbrook Elementary School Addition project, $1.3 million from the Tacoma Park Middle School Addition project, and $1 million from the Parkland Middle School Addition project. It's also important to note that transfers like these are not uncommon once projects are at or nearing closeout. So even with the $17.7 million in transfer from prior projects, the superintendent is recommending $21.6 million in local revenue sources to keep our major projects whole. I'll turn it back over to Ms. McGuire to review the overall recommendation.
Whoops. Thank you. And this slide and this chart does just show sort of the numerical summary of what we've just walked through. The four yellow rows at the top are the increased funding that the recommendation includes to, again, complete these major projects, Crown, Northwood, Woodward, and the Loiterman HVAC project. These increases are needed to fully complete the scope of these projects and, again, to keep them on track and on time. From an expenditure standpoint, what we are recommending is the reallocations that are in the blue. Those dollars are from programmed placeholder funds in the CIP that, again, do not connect specifically to projects that are scoped to the point of being ready for construction. And so we did feel that it was important to bring those dollars and those programmed resources, I should say, to support the active projects in yellow. So the yellow plus the blue, the increases in yellow minus the decreases in blue actually is what gets us to a zero request in terms of CIP expenditure increases. That's the net request. However, we do have, from a revenue standpoint, we do need additional local dollars. The reduced state aid eligibility that we've been discussing is that $39.3 million in pink. We are able to bring forward $17.7 million of already appropriated but unexpended funds to support that, which leaves us with a revenue need from the local dollars of $21.6 million. And that's the superintendent's request in summary.
So I'll take us through our current projects. We have been highlighting the project increases and reallocations. However, we want to remind everyone about the projects that are in the adopted CIP that remain on schedule, starting with Poolsville High School. So all of the projects that have completion dates that are shown on the slide will remain on schedule at their approved funding levels. Poolsville High School Phase 2 of their major capital project is set to be completed next August. The second phase of this project involves renovating the auditorium, constructing a main gymnasium, and other physical education spaces, as well as the cafeteria and the media center. Also set to open in August of 2025 are the addition at Silver Spring International Middle School and Greencastle Elementary School. The addition at Silver Spring International Middle School features new physical education spaces, which are currently out in the field house. And the addition at Greencastle Elementary provides much needed capacity relief, especially for our youngest learners. In August of 2026, the Bartonsville Elementary School and Joanne Lelek Elementary School at Broad Acres replacement projects are set to open. If you recall, the Bartonsville Elementary School will be relocating to a new pad site in the more residential areas of the neighborhood, which was master planned for an elementary school. And Joanne Lelek Elementary School at Broad Acres will also be receiving a replacement school on their current site. The staff and the students are currently at the Fairland Center and will remain there while the demolition and the construction of the new building occurs. In August of 2027, we will be opening 3 high schools and an addition at Highland View Elementary School. The Crown High School, which is a new high school, and then Charles Woodard High School will be a reopening, and the Northwood High School is being torn down and rebuilt right now. They will be temporarily relocated at Woodward High School while the remaining phases of Woodward are being built. The addition at Highland View will add capacity and support rooms for specials and other supports, as well as upgrade their accessibility throughout the site. There are 6 major capital projects on the screen that have approved planning funding and construction funds starting in FY 2029 in the out years of the CIP. These projects do not have anticipated completion date at this time. These projects are the Damascus High School, Eastern Middle School, Cold Spring Elementary, Damascus Elementary, Twin Borough, and Whetstone Elementary Schools. So as we noted on the previous slide, we're opening 2 new high schools in 2027, the new Crown High School and the reopening of Woodward High School. To establish the service areas for these schools, we're preparing a boundary study that will review the boundaries for 19 of our total of 26 high schools. The blue area on the map represents the study area for Crown High School, which will include review of potential expansions to the Damascus High School service area as well. And the orange area in the map reflects the proposed study area for Woodward High School. The RFP, or the request for proposal for the boundary study, was issued early in September, and the deadline for submission has been extended to October 31st to ensure greater vendor participation. We're working on forming a review panel for the RFP responses that will include a diverse group of community members. We anticipate bringing a recommendation for board approval to the boundary study consultant on November 21st. Once the consultant is selected, they will gather relevant data for the remainder of the year and throughout 2025. We will engage the community by holding meetings in the affected study areas. Our goal is to ensure culturally responsive engagement throughout the process. Once the study is completed, a recommendation will be presented to the Board of Education in early 2026, with a final board decision expected by March of 2026. This will allow sufficient time for us to implement the approved boundary changes by the beginning of school year in 2027. Next slide, please. So as discussed by Dr. Taylor and Ms. McGuire, the foundational work that is underway to help us prioritize our plan for our future projects, it'll start with refreshing our Facility Conditions Index, which is essentially the industry standard for assessing all of our buildings, which will replace the existing key facility indicators that we already have, but are a few years old at this point. This will provide us with more accurate assessments of our building conditions, allowing us to prioritize both our major and small capital projects. The FCI update will help us in several ways. It will guide decisions on significant capital projects, such as new school construction or major renovations. It will inform our small capital projects, including our roof and HVAC replacements. This will enable us to align our sustainability initiatives with both large and small cap projects, leading to a more comprehensive six-year systemic plan. By adopting a more holistic approach to our capital improvement plan and integrating sustainability initiatives across all of our projects, we can significantly reduce our significantly meet our greenhouse gas emission goals, lower our maintenance costs, and ultimately decrease the total cost of ownership across our entire portfolio. Reassessing our facilities and updating our FCI will ensure that our decisions are data-driven. Additionally, we will be completing feasibility studies for previously funded CIP projects. We will be engaging with the school communities and county planning throughout these feasibility studies, which will allow us to create more accurate project budgets, which will be reflected in our future CIP submissions. And I'll let Ms. McGuire take us through the end.
So this concludes our presentation of the superintendent's recommendation for the off-year CIP. Again, our focus was to keep the major projects whole, complete their scopes, and be as as judicious with our request as possible. So that's what we bring to you today.
Thank you. And I failed to ask everyone to introduce themselves. So for the viewing public, if you could please introduce yourselves so we can continue with this discussion.
Thank you. Essie McGuire, Chief of Staff.
Dana Edwards, Chief District Operations.
Adnan Mamoon, Deputy Chief Office of Facilities Management.
DJ Conley, Capital Budget and Projects Manager, Office of Facilities Management.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to ask board members to turn their lights on, but I wanted to start with one question on page 10, the reallocation of funds. I think it's important that we understand the recommendations that you're making. Could you help me understand why we don't, or why the BIMPI, the Building Modifications for Program Improvements Project, $4 million is in there? It seems like that's something that we desperately need across the county.
So I think part of this is what Mr. Mamoon was talking about. We're going to reassess and look at our facility condition indexes, and some of these smaller projects might be tied into a larger future project. And there are some remaining balances that we can tap into as well.
So if you're going to renovate the school, you may not need to change the windows right now because you're going to have to tear them down in a couple
Or a
of
new
years.
playground or new fencing, things like that.
Okay. How about the Early Childhood Center project?
So as we discussed, we are in the process of finalizing that project, our expansion plan in totality. So the thought was we were going to use $57.5 million originally to build multiple early childhood centers. We're not at that point where we know exactly where all of those buildings are going to be built, whether they're additions to existing schools or dedicated early childhood centers.
And
And
just
I'll also,
No, well, I just wanted to reiterate, too, that this recommendation does leave funding to complete the Burtonsville project. And so that's a project that, again, we do have specificity around. We know that's happening, and so those funds will remain. These funds really do relate to sort of a lot of future planning that needs to be done. And as we've discussed, as we look at how we want to provide spaces for that, we may come up with a more specific, we will come up with a more specific plan, and these dollars are truly placeholders.
Okay, so they were placeholders, we don't have sites yet, and we need the money now, therefore, we're going to borrow from those placeholders.
yeah, and I'll add one more component that needs to be a consideration. Anytime we bring a new building online, there's going to be some overhead costs associated with that, and there's going to be some ongoing operational costs, and there's a little bit of a delicate balance there. Without having a really clear-cut game plan on how the board wants to address early childhood, we need to be balancing our operational capacity, like how many physical classrooms we have, with what personnel we need to add to the operating budget in addition, because a lot of that is going to be borne by local expense too. So as we're thinking through how many classrooms we need and where those classrooms need to go, which is a critical thing, we also need to start planning out and thinking about when those classrooms open, what are going to be the ongoing personnel expense and ongoing materials expense that ties to that so that we can really address the needs for early childhood in a meaningful way.
And Mr. Mahmood, could you just reiterate why it's okay to take from the Sustainability Initiatives project?
Yes, so basically, we're leaving enough funds from prior year as well as the budget from FY '26, enough funds to continue with the current initiatives that we have. We wanted to make sure that we're taking a more holistic approach to our sustainability initiatives because we have a very aggressive greenhouse gas emission reduction goal, but we want to make sure that as we're developing our overall facilities plan for the future years, that we're blending in those sustainability initiatives throughout our projects. So we're not doing one-off projects at certain schools that might come up for renovation in 3 or 4 years. It might be better to approach that with a broader project that will allow us to, not only reduce operating costs from an electricity bill perspective and other perspective, but it will allow us to reduce our total cost throughout the portfolio.
Ms. Wolf? Dr. Taylor?
Thank you. I think you're starting to see a theme here that we probably should have articulated more clearly, which is that we may be even taking a half step back so that we're spending the money wisely. And so that even some of the things that we may be pulling back from momentarily, we're not pulling back from. We're not stepping back from sustainability. We're not stepping back from early childhood. We're not stepping back even from the identified elementary projects. We just want to make sure that they make sense and that we are expending the money to the highest and best use, in addition to completing the projects that we know are already underway and on the table. We don't want to complete another project that's half complete. We don't want to complete another project that's missing a wing of the building. We see these as really the urgent needs that need to be addressed.
Ms. Wolf?
Thank you for the presentation. I know this is not really the day to ask a lot of questions, but I just want to make a point that I'm very pleased to see Burtonsville stays on it, and disheartened to see that Eastern Middle School is being pushed back again. And if there is any way, when you're looking at what we used to call the key facility indicators again, take a really hard look at that school, because it is in really bad shape, and it really, really they really need a new building. I'm not telling you what they need, but I really would like us to look at that, because the whole time I've been on the board, it's been pushed back. Thank you.
And I do just want to clarify that this being an off year, we did not put forward any changes to the schedule that was approved by council, but I do hear you, that schedule is not what any of us would like to have, but it's absolutely on our radar for the kind of planning work that we're talking about and moving that forward in next year's ask.
I do have one other thought, though. I think I'm correct that the county has also reduced their sustainability budget some, so that they're pushing back some of their objectives.
So I don't know that I have a specific answer to that, but I do know that some of the goal setting and the climate goal setting at the county level, a lot of those have been challenging for the agencies to achieve, including county government. So I don't have any kind of specific number, but I think you're right in terms of how agencies are approaching those goals.
I just know that we did a lot of our sustainability goals to align with the county requirement to meet it by a certain date. So I didn't want people to think we were abandoning those goals, but that the county has also recognized that that may not be what we could do this year. Thank you.
Ms. Rueda?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. I just to echo what my colleagues have said before a little bit, but also I'm just, we want to be good stewards of our funding. We want to make sure that we spend wisely. But at the same token, there are schools like Damascus Elementary who have been incredible patient for decades. For me, I need to explain to the community that I represent why we're delaying this one more time when that school and like Whetstone and others, but that school is in such a, Eastern Middle School, it is such a decadence. Somebody tell me, when was Damascus Elementary built? Because I was trying to figure that out.
So we'll have to look that up.
But it was a long time ago.
While we're looking that up,
Right here.
while we're looking that up, I do
In the
want to
50s.
clarify that again, the recommendation does take some of the funding, but in order to support it, but the schedule, again, is the same as what was approved by the council last year. We're just going to do the planning work so that we can move that forward.
Yeah, so here's, and I see you've been around the block a few years. So we've been talking about Damascus Elementary way before I even got on the board. And it has, it's kind of like we rob Peter to kind of fund Paul in a sense, right? So again, it's really hard for me to explain to the community how we make these decisions, because I would like us to look at certain things. I would like us to look at enrollment. if we're looking at projection of enrollment in 2030 to be, where is that enrollment going to happen? And I can bet you some of the enrollment is going to happen in areas like Damascus. So we need, in my opinion, we need to kind of look at all those details, because I need to explain to a community that has been incredibly patient, right, how we're building these beautiful schools, right, when we're going to be delaying the quality of life at your school, and your kid's not going to see any improvements, Maybe your kids might see an improvement. But again, when we are looking at some of these schools have been built in the 50s.
1934.
1934. Okay, so we're getting up there, folks, okay?
Mr. Conley, is that the number you got?
Yeah, that's the original building, and then it was revitalized in 1980.
Right. So 1980, I wasn't even in middle school. So my point is this, right? So this makes sense on paper, but I think it's really important that when we're having these conversations, we explain to the community why things are not happening in their communities when they have been so patient. And I totally understand, but when I see Cold Spring, Damascus, Twin Brook, and Whetstone, that really hurts me, because I know we have children in those schools that the quality of life is not great because of the environment of the HVAC or because. So I just want us to make sure that we take into account the growth that we're going to be seeing in 2030, where that growth is going to be, and to prioritize it by the usage and abuse of the building that we have. In areas like Damascus, I'm just going to put it out here, are areas that historically, like the East County zone, we really don't think about when it comes to the needs. So those schools are more than just schools, right? They're actually community schools. They're providing a much more wraparound services for communities that usually don't have the services that other communities have in the down county. So I want us just to be conversant that when we look at these schools, we look at the whole picture of the effect that it has on that community and also on the morale of that community and the teachers and the kids who actually go to those schools. And I could not agree more with the pre-K. I think, transportation is another huge cost that we're going to have to look at when we are, it's not just about building pre-K, buildings and so on, but it's also how we're going to do transportation, right? When transportation is not even part of the configuration of funding that the state doesn't allocate. And that is something that we're going to have to be able to do in order, if we're serious about pre-K, right, and how that aligns with the blueprint. So there's a lot of moving pieces. But again, I would just please look again at some of the ingredients that go into making these decisions. I know at the end of the day, they're financial decisions, but they do have a huge impact on the community.
Ms. McGuire, could you help, can you just restate how it's possible to keep the projects in the same timeline, but then not have the planning funds this year?
No, I appreciate that, and I know there, again, this is a CIP with a lot of moving parts. So our recommendation does not delay the schools, and so the council approved construction funds in FY29, and we are still on track for that. And our recommendation does leave the planning funds, which are what we need to do right now. That's what we need to do, is plan for these schools, and we will do that. And the funds are in the superintendent's recommendation to do the planning for all 4 schools, Damascus, Whetstone, Twin Brook, and Cold Spring. So that planning is there, and there is still going to be some of the placeholder dollars for construction in the out years will still be there as well. So we've reserved both the planning and the capacity on the schedule that the council's approved. What we are doing is taking some of the placeholder construction dollars, which again, that planning scope work hasn't been done yet. We'll do it now, so those dollars can help us with our projects that we're doing right now. But we feel very strongly that the recommendation does not jeopardize the status of these schools.
Ms. Yang.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Good morning. I will save my project-specific questions for next time, but right now I want to ask some overarching questions. So thank you, Dr. Taylor, for bringing our attention to the reduced state aid eligibility, which the submission happened in 2021, My question will be, moving forward, how can we avoid having this happening ever again?
Yeah, certainly. State aid is not an easy thing to navigate. I don't think that this is I don't think we can pass any blame per se. We can certainly go back and look at the process that we followed, but some of this is tied to us also missing resubmission deadlines and having a window of opportunity for us to correct something, and it just didn't get corrected in the timely fashion that it should have been. That being said, I think all good things happen with internal controls. And I think that there's some discipline that we need to put in place for us, both on the operating side and on the capital side, to double check and recheck and not necessarily be in such a hurry to get something done. And candidly, I think that there's an opportunity for haste to be creating some waste in that space. And there's also an urgency to meet a budget threshold and some pressure to do that. And the reality is that we need to present the information as we know it to be true and hold to those expectations, and then clearly communicate the consequences of not having a certain amount of funding. And so I think that there's a real danger for us when we don't clearly communicate all of the consequences for not funding a project or not fully funding a project. And I think eyes wide open, if we say, this is the project, this is what we think it's going to cost, these are the ramifications for this scenario, that scenario, and the next scenario, and then we say, before we're ready to pull the trigger on this, if we don't fully support this project, funding partners, this is the likely consequence, and you will hear from your constituents this issue, and this issue, so that there are no surprises when everybody comes to that understanding. On our side, I think that it's incumbent for us to have some stability in our offices, for us to reduce turnover in those spaces, and making sure that we've got people that have a smooth handoff from a project from start to finish. And I think that will help tremendously. The volatility in staff and not having consistency, I think, has created a negative impact, both from internal culture, but also from the practical lens of some stuff falling between the cracks, and that's just unacceptable.
Okay. So from what I'm hearing, there are a lot of work to do for us to achieve operational excellence, and that will be one area of that we will be watching closely. And other question is about the clarification on page 8 of the slide, funding the CIP for the greater viewing audience. Can you please break down the percentage of each category for us to know where our funding comes from? Thank you.
So I don't know that we have the exact percentages on hand, and I'm happy to bring that back next time. I can tell you that by far the largest revenue source is bonds, and that is so the county issues bonds to pay for capital projects across all agencies, and that is by far our largest amount. Do we have the percent? And then state aid is next. So these are presented sort of in descending order. State aid is another very significant portion of the aid, of the revenues, and it's second to bonds. The taxes are important, but a much smaller percentage. Again, I'm not going to remember the percents off the top of my head, but they're much, much smaller. Really, bonds are the bulk, state aid is second, and then taxes. Current revenue is an important factor, and the county has a number of fiscal policies around having current revenue to help balance out the debt so that you don't have too much debt relative to your cash flow. But that would be a large portion as well. But again, it's tied up with a lot of fiscal policies.
Right. If I remember correctly, I think the school impact tax is about 7 or 9% of our construction fee. And today we have been looking at how we are, like other board members have referenced that we are moving money around to able to meet the needs of our community. So I know there are conversations at the county level about the impact tax and how to structure impact tax. So I will ask our community to pay close attention. We will be paying close attention because these will impact our CIP projects. Thank you.
Ms. Harris.
Yes, thank you. And first, building on what Ms. Rivera-Oven said about transportation, I will just say again, I am convinced if we can intentionally create a strategic plan for programs countywide that creates true geographical proximity, we will drive a lot fewer miles, and transportation will stop being as much of an issue, and it'll stop being our solution to access. But anyway, I have a couple of questions, and I think this is just teeing something up for maybe we can get a little bit more of a briefing. Concerns I have about assumptions in our capital budgeting process, because thinking back like 12, 15 years ago when I first started really keying in on CIP issues, I don't think we really used to build in assumptions about state aid when we were projecting costs. And I think part of that was we just knew the Interagency Commission was not going to look favorably on our capital plans because we consistently build programmatic considerations into our buildings, which is not part of that rigid, Interagency Commission structure. So we just knew we were not going to realize the maximal amount we could because of the way we built. And so we just didn't program those assumptions in. And now it seems like there are a lot, I don't want to use any word, we are building assumptions in about how much state aid a project is going to realize when we talk about overall budgets. And I think part of that is with OMB and the way they have sort of looked at how, the way we approach funding these projects has shifted over time. But also, we have gotten some things wrong, like when we did the recordation taxes, a couple years, last quadrennial subdivision staging policy review, we changed some things about how developer fees impact taxes, recordation. So we shifted a lot of those assumptions to recordation taxes. Those weren't realized, as we know, from the past two CIP cycles. So if we, not now, not for today, but just the board get a much better sense of how today assumptions are playing a role in the project costs that we're projecting going forward. Because I think that will help us do our work a little bit better. And then a question I had, I'm a very big fan of the key facilities indicators and the what you call the facilities conditions index. That was such a huge innovation and step forward in like 2018 and 2019 when we finally got rid of the sacred queue. It was a big partnership. MCPS-MD was a part of it. Facilities, when we created this approach to really looking at every school at the same time through the same set of criterion and then creating priorities. But those KFIs, K facility indicator reviews, haven't happened in a while. Do we have a plan to do those so that we can, again, I think it's been 5 or 6 years since we have looked at those tiers, and are we going to do that evaluation? Because I think I could be wrong, but I know this was pre-pandemic, but I think the initial plan when we moved to the KFI system was to redo those like every other year.
Yeah.
And that has not happened.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's what I was, when we were talking about the initiative, essentially we're talking about the same data. I just went back and we looked through the KFIs. They were very important data points and gave us a lot of good information. But there were also certain things that I saw that were missing, like the sustainability piece was not built into it. So we have an opportunity to revamp that. And whether we call it KFI or FCI, it doesn't really matter. We're talking about terminology. The idea is to just revamp the overall assessment, but build in more recent data points that we know now that we need built into that decision matrix that will help us in planning our future projects.
Yeah, because I think that does get to equity, looking at every building through the same set of lenses, and just, we don't know what we don't know. And so I think it's huge, and I appreciate that. And I do appreciate also that we've done a little bit, thanks to community input, changing to the boundary analysis RFP. So there will be much more robust, continuous community engagement, not just here and here, but throughout, which I very much appreciate, and also the very intentional inclusion of the expectation of working alongside our county partners, like planning, when we're looking at this work, because it's essential that none of this work happen in a silo. Let's see, just a little question. So I know, and I appreciate your message, Mr. Savarna, the Inflation Reduction Act, how we are going to assess the level of funding we can realize for projects we've already completed and will be doing through the Inflation Reduction Act, which helps us on our sustainability work, and it's uncapped. And so will we be getting sort of a sense of how much money we can expect to realize from that work sometime fairly in the near future?
Yes, and thank you for sharing that info with me earlier. So yes, our team is already engaged with the consultant that provided the information. So we're trying to get more additional information that will help us, and that will be part of that overall planning approach that we're taking, just to see what kind of other funding sources can we tap into, and that is potentially a great source of funding for us. So that we are looking into it right now.
Okay, good. Yeah, I look forward to hearing what your analysis shows on that. And I think the last thing for me, we've talked about this before, and I don't know if there's anything in process, but this is one of my favorite books that MCPS creates every year, and because of the appendices, which are a rich source of amazing information. I can't recommend it highly enough. Everybody should have this on their nightstand. But one of the things that we have in here is this former operating schools and their current status. And so we've talked about doing a review of this portfolio alongside our county partners to see if there are property, because we're a landlord, and that costs us money, because we're responsible for maintenance and things like that of schools that we're not using, or not. A lot of them we're not using, some of them we are, but not as schools. So we talked about looking at this, doing a really objective overview to see, can we get rid of some of these and realize a revenue source in multiple ways, both a revenue stream from the sale of a property, but also reducing our maintenance impact, and that's dollars too. So is there any, we've talked about it multiple times, I don't think it's ever happened. Or
Your question is there an update on that?
are we gonna do it?
We can follow up with an update around that request.
Yeah. Short version is we love that idea, and I think that now is a great time for us to evaluate our portfolio. We haven't made significant movement on it because we literally have been working on this instead. But yeah, it's a great opportunity right now. It's a good time right now to think about that. Looking from some of the planning data and where we're projecting over the next decade, looks to have some stability to it in terms of our projected enrollment growth. So as we're looking at that, that really does present us with an opportunity that we can right size. And I think that that's the best term that we can use kind of in the next few years is how do we right size for our district?
Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Conley, were you going to jump in?
No, I was just going to add that Appendix I, thank you, Ms. Harris, one of our favorite appendices. But we are holistically looking at our current inventory for the early childhood expansion. So that is part of the, we are identifying where can those pre-K students come from for a transportation. We don't have to transport them as far. So, and what sites can we build on easier, more cost effectively? So we are looking at the facility inventory.
And we joke with Ms. Harris that she has several publications that are her favorite, but they are very informative. They are very informative, and I think it answers a lot of questions that people wonder, and so I appreciate you putting a lot of work and energy into those publications. Thank you. Mr. Savarna.
Thank you. Kind of going back to the Inflation Reduction Act for a second. I know, like within this budget, we're talking about cutting back on our sustainability initiatives by $5 million, but completing the projects that we have already set are already being processed. So I guess my question is, has there been like a thorough analysis? And this kind of goes back to a previous question as well. But has there been a thorough analysis of what sort of tax credits or money we can get back from the federal government that would be applied to some of those projects that then, would directly impact that CIP because, it's direct money that's coming from these projects.
So that analysis has not been done. What we have, as I was talking to Ms. Harris about, we are engaging with consultants that can provide us additional data, and obviously we will have to get a vendor on board that that are familiar with doing these exercises for similar sized districts. But we are in the process of getting getting somebody engaged to help us through that. And that's an excellent question. I mean, it is going to be, we have to look at our future projects because a lot of the things that we have been installing in our schools, like the geothermals, do the Inflation Reduction Act pays for, those kind of features. So those are the things that we will be looking at as we look at not only just our current projects that are, up, in the upcoming, which are finishing in the next few years, but as well as the future projects as well.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. Just, looking at like a broad overview, like what could potentially be 30, maybe 40%, like direct payment back to the school system is a significant portion of what would be, our funds. So just really hoping to see an update on that in the future.
Thank you.
Seeing no other lights on? No other questions or comments? Well, this concludes the superintendent's presentation and our preliminary CIP work session. As a reminder, the board will receive public testimony on the recommended CIP during public hearings on November 4th and November 6th. And the sign-up information for those hearings is available on our website. And we will have plenty of opportunities to continue these discussions and ask our questions. So with that, I would like for a motion to adjourn. So moved.
Second.
All in favor, raise your hands. And that's unanimous. We are now adjourned.